Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short.
Well, good evening. You're very welcome to this second seminar for the Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health, ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, Special Interest Group. And we're delighted to have this opportunity to welcome Brian Jacobs and John Ivans, both from Bethlehem and Maudsley Hospital. And the theme this evening continues looking at the issue of ACEs, and this is Adverse Childhood Experiences for Schools, a MindEd e-learning training. Thank you, everyone, for telling us where you come from. In the chat, really helpful to get an idea of that. And I can see that I'm speaking from Sussex, where it's misty, murky, and I think that in many parts of the country it's rather like that this evening. So this is a very good place to be. So I'm going to start by asking Brian Jacobs, psychiatrist, whether he would introduce the whole notion of the MindEd training. When I saw this training for ACEs in schools, I thought this is such a powerful and helpful and useful approach. And I understand from Brian and John that it has beginning to be adopted very widely. And I hope from this evening, the introduction, there will be many more of you who will really take on board this really excellent approach that's within this training. So I'm going to start by asking Brian if he will introduce the MindEd approach so that we can really get a broad idea of what this is about and so that we can really look in detail at the content. So Brian, can I hand over to you?
Please do. So I'll start talking. MindEd, it's a free open access resource and it's available worldwide freely at the moment. It's been funded by arm's length bodies of the English government, and it provides information about mental health in relation to children and young people, adults, older generations, and people with learning disabilities. It's led by an august group of the logos at the bottom, and it's now embedded within Health Education England. And its remit is to provide accessible education about mental health, as well as more specialist information for specialists. But the MindEd approach is available through minded.org or the MindEd Hub.org, which provides the top tips, and MindEd for Families, which is information for parents and carers, which was co-developed with parents and carers. But you can access everything through the minded.org UK. It's accessible using a whole variety of information, and it's accessible from using mobile devices through to PCs. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. So the idea is to to make knowledge more generally available, so that it's not just available to the experts, but becomes available to everyone. Next slide, please. And the next. So that is the aim. If we move to the next slide. Each session involves a specialist subject matter expert, or sometimes two, Experts by experience, people who've experienced difficulties, or parents and carers or other relatives who have experienced difficulties, and helping people look after them, the index person. And quite often it involves media, and the session is brought together by ELF learning designers who basically come from a background of teaching, but also have technical skills. The whole organization is supported by program management, which is very effective, and editorial support and review teams. Next slide, please. The formats. So one format are knowledge sessions, and there are some knowledge sessions in the ACEs, which I'll show you or point out to you. They usually take about 30 to 40 minutes of e-learning. They are aimed to improve people's knowledge. They use the technology of ADAPT and a learning management system, which allows the user, if they register, to record their activity and certificates, and it also allows the central team to keep an eye on what's actually being used within MindEd. Next slide, please. The next format that we use, which I'm going to be mainly talking about today, is the skills building case studies format. And this is aimed to allow people to learn some basic skills on how to carry out certain sorts of conversations. And it uses good examples and poor examples and examples that are rescued. And I'll show you some of this. Next slide, please. So there are another section gives top tips. This was originally designed for health professionals during COVID, when they were working under very stressful conditions. But essentially, they provide very, very brief, mobile phone accessible bullet points of what will help in particular situations. Next slide, please. And then MindEd has also produced webinars, which again were produced initially for the COVID and return to schools after COVID. But they provide a great deal of information that is very useful for schools and is applicable well outside COVID. And people from other organizations might well find the principles that are embedded within them very useful. So they are recommended. Next slide, please. The usage data so far is that there are nearly 1 million enrollments, that's people logging on, and there have been over 1 million session launches, I think quite substantially over 1 million by this stage, since MindEd was launched. Okay, next slide. And that's the end of that. I'm now going to hand over back to Arnon and then on to John.
Yes, thank you. Yes, can I say thank you very much, Brian, for that most helpful introduction. Can I say thank you again to all colleagues who are attending, for giving us information in the chat. And of course, we will have a session at the end on questions and answers. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A logo. So please put your questions in that logo, in that section, and we'll hopefully be able to pick those up and have a discussion in the last half an hour that will really ensure that you really understand and can pick up issues which you're concerned about. So I think at this point, I'd like to introduce John Ivans, the head teacher at the Bethlehem and Maudsley School, who's going to talk about resilience and that tremendously important subject of general classroom management. So over to you, John. Thanks very much.
That's easy. In 20 minutes, I think we should have that late, don't you?
Yeah.
I see from the chat that we've got a lot more teachers in than we expected, which is fantastic, because I'm one of those too. This is the definition of adverse child experiences from MindEd, and in fact, it's a link to the MindEd source. I'm going to say something at the beginning, which is persist with MindEd. MindEd is a bit like a ready meal that you're trying to open and you can't get it open without a carving knife or a pair of scissors. It's really hard to get into, I find that. But once you're in there, there is a huge wealth of accessible information, really worth persisting. So it's a health warning at the beginning. Okay, next slide, please. This is a definition on the website, which is of the session itself. So as Brian's alluded, each of these sessions is a standalone, but they're all linked. And at the beginning, you have a description of what you're going to be learning, what you're going to approach. Next slide, please. The MindEd is very visually rich, and wherever possible, it tries to represent difficult and complex information in a graphic way. And here you've got two examples of that. And I think it's a slide that Brian uses a bit more clearly than mine later, which just gives across the information about the effect and impact of ACEs, what they are, and how they affect people into adulthood. But it's a lot of information, but very accessibly presented. Next image, please. So one of the slides, and when presenting this, I'm really not trying to go through each of these modules. I'm trying to give you a sense of the content so you can go off and find it yourself. This slide talks about the effect of stress, and it's linked to trauma. Very simple, but if you click on the small circles at the bottom, and we move on to the next slide, you find that you get this. Each one gives you an idea about that not all stress, in this case, is a negative thing. Some stress is necessary. Otherwise, if we all had our needs met perfectly the whole time, we would just sit in the corner and vegetate, wouldn't we? So there is a necessity for some stress to develop, to push on to the next stage, to become independent. So that's positive stress. Next slide, please. Tolerable stress is things that happen to us, but we have resources and support around us that help us get through it. We're not on our own. We have the resources within ourselves or around us to manage. And again, this is important because if we can manage levels of stress and find our way through them, then we're ready for the next difficult situation that we might face. Okay, next slide, please. However, if you have too much stress, if you have too many ACEs, too much difficulty in your life, then you can become overwhelmed by them. You become constantly fearful, constantly anxious, constantly aroused and ready for something that's bad that's going to happen. So this is toxic stress and very difficult to manage. Next slide, please. Now, in this section, there is advice on the trauma-informed approach in schools. There is training out there. It's not one that we give, but I've been on the training, and a lot of it makes a huge amount of sense. And one of the things I'd say about this ACEs, these all ACEs modules, is it doesn't just apply to a small group of young people. So many young people have experienced some kind of adverse childhood experience, but actually all of us have adversity in our lives at any particular time. And a lot of these approaches, this approach, makes sense for everyone. Of course, all children need to build trust with adults. If you are a child who's experienced a lot of adverse experiences, then it may be more difficult because your experience of adults is not one of trust. Schools, and I'm a big fan of schools, well, I would be, wouldn't I? Schools actually can and do and should provide a lot of secure relationships with adults and provide a relationship with teachers and with other staff that is warm, secure, consistent. So it's not just for the child who's experienced adverse experiences, it's for everyone. Thank you. Making sense of the past. Well, one of the difficult things about those children with those experiences is they need to have some way of recalling them and understanding them in order to make sense of them. And schools can, not by focusing on them relentlessly, but when it's right, to give the child a chance to express that story and to help them make sense of it. And of course, there are things in school which you do anyway, which can allow that to take place through subject areas, such as the ones at the bottom. Next slide, please. So once you have a chance to have your own narrative, to have a perspective on your own experience, then instead of being overwhelmed by the past, you can begin to put it to one side, make sense of it, and connect with what's going on around you, rather than expecting the trauma to be repeated on every day and every occasion. So the trauma-informed approach to schools is a very useful one to be informed about, and I would suggest it's good for all children, and in fact, for staff. Because one of the things about this is a lot of staff will have had in their past traumatic experiences, and what is good for children is pretty much good for adults too, though I wouldn't expect them all to engage in dance. Next slide, please. So again, a section, what these are is their call-outs from the modules where you get additional information. And this gives additional information about what makes a good trauma-informed school. But don't ask me about drop your personal mirror, because I don't know what it means either. But next slide, please. This is a very familiar triangle to a lot of the teachers I see that are on this call. And if we go to the slide, it's very similar to the SEND model. So yes, if we could go to the next slide, please. So yes, at the top, you're not going to be referring a lot of young people to these services. And I know that at the moment, the waiting list for some of them is huge. So, but they're there. They're increasing. There are a lot more mental health support teams out there. There are a lot more people in school who've done the mental health lead training or mental health first aid. So this is the top tier of what you would refer to for young people who have seemingly overwhelmed by ACEs and for whom your school services are not quite enough. Next slide, please. Within school and around school, there are other examples of strategies which you probably have in place already. And the last one, which is, I think, the most important slide, and Brian was saying to me he thought this was most important, it's the universal services. So next slide, please. These are very common sense, everyday suggestions, but actually are hugely important. Consistency, firmness with kindness is an easy thing to say, but very hard to put into place. The thing about schools over the pandemic, when pupils had a very, very inconsistent experience of school, I do not think the rise in mental health problems amongst children and adolescents is not unconnected with their lack of connection with school. And the very fact that schools punctuate children's development with routine, with terms, with lessons that start and finish at particular times is colossally containing for many, many children. And schools and teachers on the call, I would say that doing what you do every day consistently and fairly is hugely beneficial in containing children who have experienced adverse events. It's hugely beneficial to them. Next slide, please. This is a slide which comes at the end of the module and which really summarizes what you've covered. And each of the modules is very clear. You learn about what you're going to learn, you do it, and then you test it on it at the end in some of them. This is very good teaching strategy. It summarizes what you've done. Next slide, please. This slide is from another one of the modules, but I thought it was particularly helpful. And it's looking at those things which make children's lives easier. And the representation on the right is very, very clear. If you have access to support, individuals who are going to care in some way about you, you're in a much better position. If you have got the capacity to manage your feelings, to have some problem-solving approaches, then you are going to be in a much better place. And many schools can help support children develop these, either explicitly or implicitly in the ethos and the culture of the institution. Next slide, please. Right, classroom management. I'm going to whiz through this because I know that I'm going to run over time. If not, next slide, please. That's the outline for the module. And again, this is another opening slide. We'll go on to the next slide, please. So in the behavior in the classroom, what we're looking at is how a young person who's with bad experiences, adverse experiences, may experience the classroom differently to others. And it is that thing about constantly expecting the worst of your environment, of your experience of the world not being a cozy place. And so therefore you expect there to be threat around every corner. And so experiencing toxic threats, you may end up wanting to oppose them, fight them, run away from them, or just be incapable and freeze, not be able to respond in any way whatsoever, to hopefully disappear. Next slide, please. Some of those young people experiencing overwhelming feelings, sometimes their feelings will leak into the teacher. And that can be very difficult for the teacher to manage, because the teacher then finds themselves responding according to experiences that they've had themselves, which may echo what the child's experiencing, or just find themselves overwhelmed with the child's emotions. And that's hard. But one thing that classrooms can do when they're functioning properly is to be predictable, to not be the world as the child might expect to experience it, but as something that is routine, reliable, fair, and has in the teacher someone who is expecting that child to change. Next slide, please. Why does education work for young people? Well, there's a couple of theories which I think are quite interesting. It's about good teaching, and good teaching sets challenges for children that are both attainable, they're within their capacity, but a little bit beyond it, a little bit pushing them to learn something new. And if you as a teacher get the challenge right, matching with the child's abilities, then you get this in the first picture on the bottom left, you get this happy coincidence of flow, of eudaimonia, of being involved in work when you're engaged in it and you're developing. And that's what good teaching does, is it gets people into that zone. And it's quite a hard one to do, but it's fantastic when you get it there. That's one theory. And I will say the name begins Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and it took me a long time to work out how to pronounce that, but I'm so proud of myself, I had to share that with you. On the right, Barbara Fredrickson, Broaden and Build. It's a very interesting one, and it's on the left-hand side, the spiral going down. It's about threat, meaning that your focus becomes very limited. You're looking at where the threat presents itself, and it tends to feed on itself. If you feel threat, you feel stress, you feel negative emotion, you constantly narrow down, and in that emotional state, you cannot learn. You need to be open. And instead, on the right-hand side, it's about having a classroom which is very calm, very purposive, where actually the stress in the class, and hopefully therefore in some of these young people, reduces. And when stress reduces, then you get more creative. You can look outside, you can look outside the box. You're looking for solutions and being imaginative. And so both of those theories, I think, are useful to consider as part of what schools do in particular, which is different to what others do. Okay, next slide, please. Again, in the module, very sensible, practical advice about what to do and how to make schools a supportive place for those who have otherwise experienced things as threatening. I'm not going to go through each one. I don't have time on this one. So next slide, please. A good graphic here, a very simple one. Again, going back to the trauma-informed and compassionate classroom. What makes it good? What do you need to do? How do you set it up? These are things which are not unfamiliar to teachers. They say, well, there's nothing I don't know here. It's the challenge of putting it in place. Next slide, please. Graphic, but actually representing something quite complex of past experience turning into feelings, which then turns into behavior, then feeds into the staff and feeds back potentially to the young person. It's not nice for staff to feel those feelings which young people project, and ends up with conflict. And represented on the right, how experiences can lead to feelings and then behaviors. Next slide, please. So when you are on the module, you can click out to this further information, which has some very, very straightforward guidance as to how to manage, what to develop in your school. The one at the bottom, I have stolen from Bill Rogers. And if you have a problem with behavior, I would absolutely tell you to go to Bill Rogers online and look at the very practical things that he suggests. The take-up time is a wonderful one. It really means you give an instruction and then give the child some time to get over the difficulty they have with following that, so that you don't get into a conflict. Lovely stuff. Next slide, please. A lot of these things are totally familiar to class teachers. Catching young people being good. So ignoring that which is designed or feels designed to provoke, and finding when they are doing something unexpectedly, perhaps for them, which is positive. Also, it's important that somebody notices that, because they may not notice that themselves and therefore begin to think about themselves in a different way. Rule. You could do a huge session on that, because rules are there to be broken and rules are there to be applied intelligently. And the thing about young people who are emotionally unstable at times is they get into a position where they cannot follow them. So rules need to be applied sensibly, and they need to be, rigidity needs to be flexed when dealing with children with these difficulties. Next slide, please. Guidance that I've found very useful in talking to staff is talk slowly, lower the pitch of your voice, don't use complex sentences, and actually be quieter. And that's a really, really hard thing to do, because when you're confronted with high expressed emotion, you tend to mirror it. You need to actually be the calmest person in the room. And that's tough, but it's really important. So lots of bits of guidance in these modules which lie outside the initial presentation, which you can dig into. Next slide, please. We'll go over this one. I realized it was too dense for me to approach on this one. Could we go on to the next slide, please? So this is a summary on this module, what you would cover if you did it. Remember, they take about 30 to 40 minutes. They're not long. They're not long, but they contain a huge amount and lots of references and connections to other material as well. Next slide, please. This is what the ACEs module looks like, and all the modules there on the right. And you can see on the left how big MindEd is. It is just finding the right bit for yourself, but it's a fantastic free resource. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And thank you for the comments in the chat. And thank you for the questions which are coming into the Q's and A's. Please make sure they keep them coming, because I think they will all enable us to have a really very useful discussion. So we're in good time, which is great. So Brian, you have a little extra time. You can be more relaxed during your presentation. And I think that, Brian, you're going to talk about group and individual skills learning in MindEd and how you can learn from this material. And I think you have some very interesting video materials, so it'll be very nice to have the opportunity of looking in more depth at these brilliant materials. So Brian, let me hand over to you for this section.
Thank you, Anand. So what I'm going to do in this section of the presentation is I'm rather frustratingly not going to teach you skills to manage these conversations. What I am going to do is to lead you through and show you how you might use the material. If we can go on to the next slide. So if you go on to MindEd at minded.org.uk, you get brought to the section that you see on the left, and there is a section in there, if you click on the picture of the young lady, for professionals and volunteers. There's a section lower down for parents and carers, and below that, but not on this slide, there's a section for the elderly. You will see on the left that you can sign in or register, but you don't have to. You can use all the material, and it is entirely free, and you can use it as a guest. But you can sign in, and if you do so, it will log what you've done and allow you to print off a CPD certificate after you finish a session. Arrow down, next bit, please. So, no, go back. Thanks. What I've circled up on the right is that there is a box which I've enlarged from the left for searching the e-learning. And if you put in what you're actually trying to look for, whether it's anxiety or adverse childhood experiences, the right material will come up. However, I have just learned that if you put in ACEs, ACES, nothing appears, which is a real failure on MindEd's part, and we're going to bring that to their attention. But I'm sure if you put in adverse, a lot of relevant material will appear. Next slide, please. So when you click on the young lady for professionals, you will be faced with all these logos, which go into different sections of MindEd. And the particular one we're going to talk about today is MindEd Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what is not there is that this material is particularly aimed for teachers. You will see the next one alongside it is MindEd for Blue Light Services, because they also have needs, and like the MindEd for Adverse Childhood Experiences, there are sessions in that are knowledge transfer sessions, and there are other sessions which are skills building, which of course are a hybrid of knowledge transfer and the videos to build skills. Next slide, please. So if you go into the ACEs section, there are 6 sessions available to you. The 2 sessions that John has spoken about, I've put in red boxes. And the 3 sessions that are skills building sessions, of which 2 of which I'm going to refer to, have S underneath them in red. The one I'm going to discuss in detail is anxiety and distress in the classroom. I'm not going to go through behavioral issues. These skill building sessions really need a minimum of an hour. And if you're working on them in a small group rather than on your own, which is, I think, a very good way to use the material, then actually a single session could take 2 or more hours. Okay, let's move on. And again. So when you go into that session, the first thing you see is this screen, and you have to click on the how-to guide, which tells you how to use the session. And I'm going to lead you through that section first, and then we'll move on to the other sections. Next slide, please. So the instructions are basically, they're asking you, are you using this by yourself, or are you leading a workshop? Are you going to use the material to lead a workshop? And if you're using the material to lead a workshop, you're given the opportunity to download more of the PDFs that lie behind the session earlier. And you submit whichever you're going to do, and it takes you to the next slide. And I've gone in as a single user for the purposes of this, and you get some instructions. The most important thing to realize is that the video examples that we use are really very compressed. So you'll look at them and you think, oh my God, that can't possibly happen that quickly. But of course it doesn't in real life. But what we're trying to do is to provide you with the maximum amount of bang for your buck, really, in terms of material. And of course, video is remarkably expensive to make. Okay, so on to the next slide. If you click on the box in the middle, it will take you to a PDF that illustrates the skills development and how you might get set about doing this. So practicing on your own, try saying it out loud, rehearse it with another person, consider videoing yourself. Very easy these days using your own mobile phone. And then look at yourself, and that's a horrible experience for all of us, however often we do it. And think, what did I do well? What would it be like to be on the other side of this interaction, either a teenager or a youngster or a parent? Okay, and then try using the skills in a live situation. So you do need to practice skills development. Okay, next slide. This slide we took from the Samaritans website because it captures active listening very well. I have to say, I wasn't taught active listening until after I had become a consultant, and I'm not quite sure why not. But anyway, these are really helpful tips, showing you care, having patience, using open questions rather than questions that invite yes/no answers, checking back that you've understood, trying not to interrupt, something I find quite difficult. Have courage and don't be put off by negative responses and grunts, because actually young people will be hearing you. Check available resources. So if you are going into a difficult conversation, you might well have thought beforehand, where can I find appropriate resources that might support this young person? And being able to at least indicate that you can help them goes a long way, even if you can't give it to them there and then. And also in these difficult interactions, do remember you need to look after yourself as well. You may need advice, you may need mentoring, and supporting someone who is distressed often is distressing for the person doing the supporting. You learn to contain it, but it is distressing. Next slide, please. So there's then advice about how to use the videos. And through this session, I'm going to be highlighting 2 videos, Billy and Mum Go to School, which only lasts a total of 1 minute and 15 seconds, and the Kaylee and Regina video, which lasts almost 3 minutes. There are 2 other videos in this session, but we don't have time to go into those in detail. I will be talking about them to varying extents. When the videos are finished, it tells you what to do, and you'll find that there are questions embedded in the videos. Okay, next slide, please. So I've thrown up this slide just to point out that although this is called a skills building session, there are a number of slides through it that are actually giving you knowledge. Okay, next slide, please. A typical MindEd presentation technique is to try to make things active for the person who's using the material on the web. So you might be presented with 2 pictures, and then next slide, if you click on each of them, you get the information on the reverse, so the pictures flip. Okay, next slide. And then you'll get a further panel of material giving you more information. Other information transfer active user involvement slides run as a sort of series going across the page, or using the little logo that you'll have seen in John's presentation to click on to move across. Again, giving more information on each time. Next slide, please. So when you come to the video scenarios and the video examples, each video is intended to be watched right through from beginning to finish. And the screen that contains the video looks a bit like this, with an arrow at the bottom left that you click on to start the video. And you can make the video go to full screen. I've actually taken the videos out. And so if we go to the next slide, we can watch the whole of the first interaction.
We're going to be late for school again.
I'm sick.
Oh, you're not sick. It's the 3rd time this week you said that. Come on, hurry up, eat up now.
I don't want to go to school. They hate me. My teacher, Mrs. Kendall, doesn't even care that Tommy Marshall told everybody I'm a crybaby. I only cried once.
Billy, I can't afford a babysitter to look after you while you're here. Mum's got to keep a roof over her head.
Can't Dad come over?
Dad? There's no way he's coming here. We've talked about this. Now listen, if you're not going to eat that breakfast, get those school shoes on. We've got 2 minutes to get out of here. Look, I know you've fallen out with some of your friends at school, but don't worry about it. Next year you're going to be at senior school and you make loads of new friends.
What if I can't make new friends?
Of course you will. Now, I'm going to drop you here, okay?
Aren't you coming in with me?
No, you're a big boy, Billy. No, look, you don't need me. Next year you're going to have to go in on your own. So look, I'm going to go. I'll see you after school, okay?
Okay, so after watching the video right through, you're invited to reflect on what you've seen, okay? And it then goes on to give you the opportunity to watch the video again, but it actually has pauses. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to show you the first bit again.
We're going to be late for school again.
I'm sick.
Oh, you're not sick. It's the 3rd time this week you said that. Come on, hurry up, eat up now.
I don't want to go to school. They hate me. My teacher, Mrs. Kendall, doesn't even care that Tommy Marshall told everybody I'm a crybaby. I only cried once.
Billy, I can't afford a babysitter to look after you while you're here. Mum's got to keep a roof over her head.
Okay, next slide, please.
We're going to be late.
No, that's it. So At that point in the video, and I've chopped the videos up for this presentation, but at that point you would get this screen appear. Is Billy really speaking about what's troubling him? Is Mum responding in ways that may help him deal with that? And then the answer, if you click on the arrow on the right, is that Billy is using the language of physical illness instead of feelings and thoughts. He may have be trying to bunk off school, but actually it's quite likely that there's anxiety. Okay, and what about his mother? Well, actually, she seems very fraught and stressed herself. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the next bit of video. After that, there's been the pause in that video, which happens automatically for you. So let's go on with this.
I only cried once.
Billy, I can't afford a babysitter to look after you while you're here. Mum's got to keep a roof over her head.
Can't Dad come over?
Dad? There's no way he's coming here. We've talked about this. Now listen, if you're not going to eat that breakfast, get those school shoes on.
That's it. So then the next question comes up around that point. What do you think about the way Mum spoke about this child's father? And the answer, I think, is the next slide. She's transmitting fear, anger, and hinting at Dad being very difficult and possibly even violent. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And then it points out that actually that interaction has left Billy going to school without breakfast, and that can worsen symptoms of anxiety as well as not being healthy. And then you continue with the same video into the second scene. So next slide, please. Okay, and if you start the video.
I know you've fallen out with some of your friends at school, but don't worry about it. Next year you're going to be at senior school. You make loads of new friends.
What if I can't make new friends?
Of course you will. Now, I'm going to drop you here, okay?
Aren't you coming in with me?
No, you're a big boy, Billy. No, look, you don't need me. Next year you're going to have to go in on your own. So look, I'm going to go. I'll see you after school, okay?
Okay, so what's Billy saying here? And essentially, we're inviting you all through group discussion, and you might come up with this response or something similar, or you might come up with other things we haven't thought of, which is actually really very helpful. So let's move on to the next slide. So the session continues with a video of Mum with the school teacher. Now, I'm not actually going to play this video, but I'm going to take you through it with some screen captures that I've taken. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is another occasion, and Mum is in the school building, and the teacher comes down the corridor and says, "Do you have time for a quick chat?" Mum says, "I'm in a rush." And the teacher has referred to her using her married name, and the mother says, "No, actually, I'm using my maiden name." The teacher has her own agenda, and her agenda is that Billy's late and that Billy's behaviour has deteriorated. So she asks Mum to make a bit more of an effort to get him there on time, and you can see Mum's non-verbal reaction. She's not desperately happy about this. Let's move on. And the teacher refers to him fighting, and then you get a pause in the second time round, because you've watched it through once beginning to end, where it asks you about what's going on, and it points out that Mrs. Kendall has rushed into this for a quick chat, and actually this isn't a quick chat. And you can see Mum's getting really quite irritated, and Mrs. Kendall, the teacher, probably should be curious and not move on in the way that she does. Okay, let's move on. And Mum then really becomes very angry. You think I'm not trying? He dreads coming here. He's being bullied, and he's being left out. And look at their mutual non-verbal communication that reflects each other. They're both pretty cross at this stage. And the teacher's quite taken aback by bullying and then immediately suggests a solution. And this probably isn't a good moment to immediately suggest a solution. So let's move on to the next slide. And we then get another pause and the second question. Time to think about it yourself or as a small group, and then our suggested answer, but we're very open to other points of view as well. Let's move on. So Mum is still very aroused. You're not listening. He's worried about his SATs and he's being bullied. And then it asks you to think about how Mrs. Kendall might be feeling at this point. Let's move on. And Mrs. Kendall manages to rescue the situation at this point. She says, why don't we go to my office? Okay, and we can talk in there. Now, of course, this is compressed, but the great thing about some of these videos is that, and they're designed this way, is we all fall into traps. We don't do everything right all the time. And this is meant to illustrate that the teacher is able to sway at this point, realize what's going on, and create some emotional space for herself. And she makes a cup of tea for their mother, and they're able to start talking about what's going on. And they get to a point where the mother is able herself to acknowledge that part of what she's worried about is that actually her son Billy is behaving very much like she did when she was at school, that she was really quite frightened at school. And that's probably part of what's been driving her responses as well. Let's move on. So we then move on to some more information about toxic levels of stress, which you've already had presented to you in relation to another session. And we'll move on to the next slide. Oh, yes. Can we go back? Sorry. The reason I put a circle around there is that slide refers to two other MindEd sessions. And by clicking on the box on the right for each of those, it will open up in a new window the particular session. And a lot of children who have ACEs actually have been suffering or suffered from complex trauma and PTSD. Okay, let's move on to the next slide now. So we now move on to a different situation in this session. And we're moving on to a secondary school situation and a year 11 girl who has been isolated because of bullying. Next slide, please. And I'm showing you this clip of Kaylee and Regina, both of whom are year 11 students. And the reason I chose to show you this clip is that actually you might want to use it in PSHE. It seems to me that it begins to capture how friends might help each other and would form quite good discussion material. And you don't have to use the whole of the session. You can just use this clip. Let's move on. And I'm just going to play the clip through for you.
Hey Kaylee, I haven't seen you around for a while.
Enjoy Son's party then.
Yeah, I did actually. You would have too if you'd come.
Didn't feel like it. Anyway, wasn't invited, was I?
Well, you haven't exactly been a barrel of laughs lately. You never want to come out. Sam probably just forgot to invite you. Nobody's trying to leave you out on purpose.
Really? Then why did they make up those rumours about me, huh? You know, I can't even go on my phone without seeing you guys have a great time all over my timeline. Just leave me alone.
Oh, come on, lighten up, Kaylee. That was weeks ago. Sometimes people say stupid things. It's not that serious. What's that?
It's nothing.
Kaylee, are you all right?
Yes.
No, you're not. I know what self-harming looks like.
It's just... sometimes I feel like everything's crashing down on me and I don't know what to do. I can't think, I can't sleep, I can't breathe. doing this is the only thing that makes me feel better. For a second it just takes the pressure off and I feel alright for a little bit. Till that sinking feeling in my stomach comes back.
I'm so sorry, Kaylee. I didn't realise. Why didn't you say anything?
People already think I'm mental. What would they say if they saw this? Everyone else is getting on with it, going out, having fun. Why can't I cope?
Does anyone else know about this? My sister went through something like this. You don't have to deal with it alone. There's loads of help out there. My sister even liked speaking to the school counsellor. She said it really helped her. Why don't you come round mine this weekend? We'll have a movie night. Just us two. Then we can figure out how we'll get you some help.
Thanks. That'd be nice.
Next slide, please. I have to say, I always find that a very powerful video clip. The session moves on to Kaylee with her teacher, who's played by the same actress as before, although it's a different situation. And this is actually a good interview. And of course, we do that because we don't want teachers to feel that we're just getting at them at all, because that's not the purpose of all of this. The teacher shares during the course of this interview that she went through quite an anxious time. In fact, the self-harm doesn't become apparent in this clip, and this clip runs through in the standard way. You watch it through the first time, and then you watch it through with pauses and suggested questions and answers. Okay, while I remember, there is a separate set of sessions on self-harm in schools, which is another of those logo buttons that you can go, that I showed you at the beginning. And that gives a lot of information and also some video clips in skills building sessions for teachers. In addition to that, there's similar information elsewhere for adult self-harm, and there are also sessions, as you've seen, for anxiety and PTSD elsewhere in the MindEd. You have to find them, but they are all there. Let's move on to the next slide. So after the video clips, there's more information about help with behavior, and there is a PDF you can download, which gives a lot of useful information, again, fairly condensed, but it's a very good starting point. Next slide, please. Now, in every session in MindEd, at the end of the session, there is a summary of the session, and then there are key resources. So I'm going to just show you on the next slide related sessions. Next slide, please. And which are on the left, and you can click on each of those sessions, and also websites that are relevant. From time to time, the links to the websites break down because people change their website addresses, but I've usually found that if you search in Google or Bing or whatever, you can find the relevant material. Let's move on to the next slide. And then for further reading, there will be websites or documents that you can download. So you're given a wealth of resources. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go through behavioral issues in the classroom because we won't have time to do it. But essentially, Mr. Sharp and Luke get into a contretemps. Mr. Sharp is a well-meaning teacher. However, his review has said that he's not keeping up with his work. He has a wife and a new baby at home, and they're not getting much sleep. So he's arriving at school late, and his wife is on edge as well. And all of this goes into the mix as to how things go wrong between Luke and Mr. Sharp. And then there are videos of how it can go much better. And incidentally, Luke has a very middle class sort of accent, which is really partly to bring home the point that actually ACEs do not just affect children who come from difficult backgrounds, they go right across society. Okay, let's next slide. So usage of MindEd. So during September this year, there were 529 ACEs session launches, and people spent a total of about 308 hours looking at MindEd material. And you'll notice in that month, the total session launches were 7,500, and people spent about just over 3,500 hours. So MindEd is a useful resource. As John and I are both saying, it requires some persistence, but because the quality of the material is actually really very good. And it's presented in a way which is much more attractive than many e-learning sites that I've come across. Next slide, please. So if anyone wants to contact me, they can do so at the top email address. And if they want to contact MindEd, the team can be contacted through the MindEd inquiries. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Over to you, Armin.
Fantastic, Brian. Really very, very interesting. And as you say, the videos are excellent, and they are very expensive, but one learns such a lot. There are some really very interesting questions have come up, which I would like. Are there one or two? Yes. Yes, Jody Harvard. Are there targeted modules for workers who aren't classroom-based and are session-based, delivering targeted work along with other trauma work? Now, that's a good question.
I'm afraid not. Our funders go for large populations. However, the material is really very applicable, and I think if you work through it yourself or with a group of people who have similar work, or even mixed groups, I think you'll find that actually really interesting angles on what you're looking at comes out. I mean, Raf Kelvin and I designed the shape of skills building material very much in terms of what we learned when we were trainees and we were taught by our teachers, in terms of how to use video, how to use observation through a one-way screen, those sorts of things. And we've supplemented it with other materials. And I think the recipe that we came up with has actually been a successful one. And certainly we've had very good feedback on it.
Thanks, Brian. There are some really very interesting points which I'd like you to discuss. A very important point was raised. Let me just see. Yes, by NW, who says, how can a teacher take on the role of a counsellor in addition to classroom responsibilities? NW is a counsellor who works as a counsellor, and she's concerned about the pressure and the balance between the teacher's role as counsellor and the teacher as teacher. So I'd be interested if you can comment on that very interesting interface, which MW, sorry, if I hadn't got your name, which NW raises, because I think it really is a core issue, isn't it?
John, do you want to have a first shot at that?
Yes, I don't think that teachers should become counsellors, but I think they can be informed by some of the ideas that counsellors used. I think that there is much in what teachers do day by day, which is hugely constructive and containing for young people who find the classroom very difficult to manage. And it is by maintaining that safe space that they have a daily impact on children with trauma. But they can't turn themselves into counsellors, because they have to do the job of teaching, and they've got another 29 children in the class who need their attention. So no, they shouldn't, but there is much to be understood and much to be learnt, which can inform their relationships with children outside the class, in the playground, with parents, engaging with that. And it is a useful set of skills that over a teacher's life, I think all teachers should build on slowly, but they should absorb them.
Thanks very much.
Shall I?
Yes, please.
I would have a slightly different view, inevitably, which is that I don't think they can avoid it. I think inevitably that's built into their role, whether they realize it or not. And that doesn't mean that's the central thing that they're doing all the time, but it is the thing that they're doing around the edges. And for a few children, they may do considerably more. And it's that and learning what they can do that's universal, which John's talking about how they actually run their classes, I think. And what is it, when is it appropriate to do that bit more? And it's well worthwhile holding in mind research that was done years ago now, that basically shows that children who, and they weren't called ACEs at the time, but children who have had difficult events or periods in their lives, that a reliable adult, and that can be a school teacher, or it can be a youth worker, or it can be a parent or an uncle or a relative, it can be a number of different people, but a reliable adult in adolescence can really turn that child's life around, so that when those children are visited again in adult life, they do not have all the sequelae that you might have expected them to have, and that a group of children that didn't get those interventions do have. So it's very well worthwhile. It impacts personally and for society.
I think that's
my soapbox.
No, it's fine. I think it's very interesting the number of really well-known people in sports and in many different areas who say there was this one teacher who believed in me, who supported me, and that obviously made a huge difference. Now, a very interesting point has been raised, which was just a little comment by MW, who talked about fighting fire with water, which picks up the point you make, John, about being the calmest person in the room. I think that metaphor, fighting fire with water, is it's a very nice one. But
unless it's an electrical fire, but we don't know.
Or an oil fire.
Quite, exactly, good point. But another important point that was raised, I think Melanie Hardcastle brings up a very interesting point, and a number of questions have come up about the issue of children and young people with neurodevelopmental disorders. For example, she makes the point that young people with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, need to have teachers who respond in very similar ways to children who are obviously showing evidence of high arousal, anxiety associated with traumatic experiences. And she wonders how many teachers of children and young people with ADHD and other neurodevelopmental disorders are taught those skills, which is an interesting point to raise.
Shall I go on that one? I think that with teacher training these days, it's varied. And I suspect that there is not so much of a focus on addressing individual children's needs, however they present themselves. And you've got three different types of groups there with different needs. I'm not sure how much they are taught about this. And that's why I think those people in schools with experience need to find ways to share what works. And clearly, even within those groups, you will have children who present those difficulties in their own individual way. So it's very much having a bag of tricks, well, not so much tricks, of skills and experience, which allow you to try something and allow you to fail. And I think it's desperately important that teachers are allowed to fail. If teachers are not allowed to fail in schools, how can pupils fail? And I know as a head teacher, I'm very good at failing. So it's an important skill and an important one to model to younger staff or staff that are less experienced than ourselves, of trying something and knowing that it may not work, but that's okay.
Brian, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I suppose the thought that was going through my mind is, I think John's summary of what trainee teachers are exposed to in college is absolutely right, and they're not exposed enough to issues around mental health as well. But I hope that in, I don't know, perhaps 15 years' time, John would be giving a very different answer. You know, I really hope that it's gradually percolating into the system, but actually you can't teach children who can't concentrate, and they can't concentrate if they're completely messed up with other things going on. You know, it's pretty basic.
Yes, I think that an interesting point has just been raised, which is the idea, and one of the thoughts that I had was, I wonder whether there is a need in thinking about a training such as the MindEd, to think of training at a number of levels. In other words, there's PHSE levels. In other words, what should be available to all children and young people as part of their general education. What's for the general staff, teaching staff, and what about the support staff? Because obviously so many schools have got counsellors and have got support, particular support staff, and I just wonder if you could possibly think about the different levels of training that those different groups might benefit from in terms of what they might take from the MindEd training.
So the sort of broadening it out and not just focusing on schools, the core MindEd program, which you'll find as one of the logo sets, contains information that is really meant to be applicable to any non-specialist, applicable to teachers, to social workers, to religious leaders, to sports coaches, you know, to anyone who's working with young people and children. And it's written at that sort of level. There is more specialized material available for people who are specializing in working with children, in particular in the mental health services. But yes, there are lots of cuts you could make through that would provide different lenses. It all, I'm afraid, at the end of the day, it all comes down to money. You know, a lot of money has been put into MindEd, but each session is expensive to produce, and the reason it's expensive is because a lot of effort goes into the technical production of high quality material, not just the words that the authors write at the beginning, and that costs money because it takes time. I think the results are well worthwhile, but you can't do everything for everybody. So there is a lot of material on the MindEd website. We're just highlighting material that's been developed for schools. I think if the Department for Education were to decide that it wanted to have a more fine-cut approach to this, I'm quite certain that MindEd would be very open to developing that, and would work with people who are on the receiving end at that level to make sure that it was targeted to the right audience.
Okay, thank you. John, do you want to add anything to that?
Just one of the things that doesn't always keep to it, but the MindEd ethos is that when you're writing for it, you have to write. Is it a reading age of 12? Right?
Yeah.
And that's not to condescend. It actually is a real discipline because you find yourself finding a nice long word and then chucking it out because actually that's ridiculous. So a lot of the MindEd materials are designed to be accessible. That's not to say, I was thinking about teaching assistant and lunchtime support staff. I was thinking about people who don't necessarily have an academic background. It is designed to be accessible. Those video clips that Brian showed, they're kind of interesting. You get lost in them. They're very well produced. And the quality of them is very high, so that you engage with the humanity of it alongside the technical. So I think there are lots of the materials which, in spite of their intentions, are very accessible. That's the whole ethos behind the project, which I think is very laudable. I'm seeing some comments come up on the chat, about the difficulties for schools who don't have, or teachers, and there's a comment here by Wellington F, and it's about the pressure on teachers to teach curriculum. And I fully understand that. And that's why, in a sense, I think some of these skills need to be taught in how you behave and how you structure the classroom, not as a separate curriculum. It's how you are as a teacher, how you are as a school, how you treat and support each other. It's not necessarily an additional subject or a separate thing that you do. It just becomes part of you. And we all know, we all know, but I'm talking from a teacher's point of view, is that you find that there are some members of staff who are miraculous. You can't work out what they do. And what needs to be done is to be able to understand what it is about them as individuals. They're often very honest and are themselves, truly themselves, in the classroom and in the staff room. How we can learn to be ourselves in school and not to put on a mask of an expert the whole time, but to be genuine, but supportive and caring and thoughtful. That helps everyone if we do that for each other and for ourselves as well.
Thank you. Because this is an ACAM audience, some very interesting issues have come up, particularly about children and young people, where there's intergenerational issues that come up, particularly the recent research which demonstrates that that parents who themselves have had abusive experiences, or when there's problems during pregnancy or during births, and the issues of FASD and ASD, in other words, all the complexities which we now know, really means that the ACEs score as a sort of risk index is oversimplified. In other words, mitigating factors, protective factors, the perception of experiences, blue experiences, or over optimistic. In other words, we're in a phase of very significant interest about the ACEs and the complexity, and therefore the issue comes in: what about the complexity of the young people and their presentations, given the multiple sources of stress and the multiple sources for children and young people in terms of how they present, and how does this very generic approach fit with the growing complexity of our field, really?
I'm going to turn that on its head, all right? Because one of the things you learn in medicine, and I can't help it, I'm a doctor, is that the human body has a limited number of ways of responding to any toxic exposure. And what you see with all these very complex and interacting forms of causation is that they tend to funnel down to variations on relatively few themes in terms of what you will see in the classroom. Now, what you do to understand and support will tend to become tuned, or should become tuned, to the particular young person that you're talking about. But you will do that in a human way. They will communicate how you need to tune it to you. Let's just take ADHD as an example. There are a limited number of ways that ADHD will present. There are myriads of causes. There probably is no single ADHD, but what you do about it and how you respond in school, probably there won't be one way, but there are probably fewer than 10. Would that be right, John? You're muted.
No, I think you're right. We're a regional, local, regional, national resource, so we have young people from all over the country at times, and with complex issues. And then we have to write reports back to the schools. And one of the things I'm very aware of is that those teachers need some 3 bullet points as what's going to help on Monday morning. And actually, it's really simple. It really isn't. You're absolutely right. It's probably less than 10. And mostly it revolves around having somebody ask them once a day how things are going. That's pretty much a blanket one, having somebody show interest in it. But there are a limited range of responses. And there are not hugely complex interventions for lots of difficulties, especially children with ACEs in school. They're really quite common sense when you come down to it. Speaking to teachers quite often, I will say, do you have the experience of specialists coming in and giving you advice which you already knew? And it's not necessarily that you carried it out, but did you have that? I said, it's not because the specialists are not good, it's that you know more than you think. And often teachers, we're not very good at owning our own expertise. And we've been bashed over the head quite a lot over recent years. And people misunderstand just the skill that it takes to be a good teacher. And we need to own it a bit. And it is common sense in many, many ways. And it is focusing down on what that individual child needs and actually being open to hearing what that child's needs. And I don't mean just words. I mean just thinking, what is it that I need to be doing now?
And don't hear me saying that I think it's easy, because I absolutely don't. I think it's a very subtle process, but I do think good teachers learn it, and some have it instinctively, and some really struggle with it. You know, they want to revert to the rules all the time.
I did when I started, and I learned huge amounts from other people.
Yeah.
I think it seems to me we're just coming to the last bit, but it seems to me that that from what your presentation demonstrates, that the school is a core setting. That I remember one point that I noticed in one of the slides where you said at least half the young people are likely to have had one or more form of adverse experience, and that experience will be responded to in very different ways. And the reality is that whatever the experience is, whatever our diagnostic approach to which we take as mental health professionals, the reality is that a great many children are going to have a variety of responses, which, as you say, Brian, can actually there are not that many ways of intervening, and we know when we look at modular approaches that actually many approaches do similar things. So it may well be that the skills and the number of that can be offered in schools through both the individual services that schools can provide through counselling and other, and also the general approach from teachers really could make a huge difference to the many children who come to school every day with experiences of adversity. So I do feel that we would need to demonstrate that this really makes a difference to the mental health of young people, to really demonstrate that this approach needs to be universally adopted across all our educational contexts, I think. So any last points that you both would like to raise? Any other take-home messages that you would want to give the many colleagues who are listening today?
John, you're muted.
I just saw a comment by an anonymous attendee about a school where, how do I persuade the school to become trauma informed? And then I saw that this school had 2 student deaths 2 years ago. And I immediately thought, well, actually, maybe the school is traumatized. And maybe you need to approach it differently. You need to step back and actually say, these people want to avoid the pain and suffering that it would be faced by looking at that head on. So I think that's a direct response to that chat. But I think that actually what I would say, and you said this to me, Brian, the other day, is the first place we need to look is to support ourselves, whatever setting, whether we're in the school, whether we're in a CAM service, whatever, is how do we actively support each other on a day-to-day basis? Because if we can't do that, then we're not going to be much use to anybody else. So I think all of us, some of us will have had traumatic experiences. I suspect that within CAM services and schools, there's probably a high proportion in some ways represented, and that's why people end up doing what they're doing. It's not necessarily bad, but we need to look after each other and ourselves.
I can't better that, John.
I would only add that there's one point that Donna Williams has raised just literally at the end, that heads of schools are recognizing we have to support parents first who have and had adverse experiences before we can start to think about how they can support the children. So I think that's a very powerful point, that we need to be thinking about supporting parents, and that the school and the community, parents and families are really should be working together. But John and Brian, thank you so much for a really very interesting presentation. And looking at the chat, it's quite obvious that many people have really found the approach very useful and will hopefully sign on and use this wonderful free resource. And I want to remind everybody here that the next seminar is going to be on the 1st of December, and Kate Daniels is going to be talking about working with host families for the Ukrainian families that are coming here as a result of the war in Ukraine, and that she's going to talk about the fact that the Association of Family Therapy have offered time and resources to help and support these families. So she's going to speak about that experience on the 1st of December. So thank you everyone for taking part. Thank you for the comments you've made and the questions. And we'll share the questions round so that if there are other issues that anybody wants to raise, and that John and Brian can. And just to remind you that a recording of this session will be available with the slides and links to the material. So hopefully you'll get the opportunity to think about these issues in further detail. So thank you very much, and thank you, Team ACAMH, for your support. So thank you. We'll end the session now. Thanks very much. Okay, terrific.
Find out more about becoming an ACAM member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health. Visit www.acamh.org.